This presentation covers the 2 decades from 1870 to 1890. Fashion historians call this the Bustle Era, named after the back shaping of women's skirts. Social status was the main concern of the Victorian middle and upper classes. Society was rapidly evolving with a huge influx of newly wealthy or newly middle-class individuals. The race to become or remain socially acceptable was competitive. The correct status could ensure future comfort, the children's placement in the correct schools, or advantageous marriages or new acceptance in business and society. New York City was transformed when the ultra-wealthy began building European-style palaces from the 1870s to about 1900, most of which were then demolished in the 1930s to make room for new high-rise buildings. It fell to the wives and daughters of wealthy men to accomplish and ensure correct social status using a combination of entertainments, leisure activities, and charity events. Diary accounts of families like the Vanderbilts describe mansions and social functions on a scale it is hard for most of us to imagine today. The obvious displays of wealth have earned this era the term the Gilded Age, or the era of the robber barons. The concentration of massive wealth in a small percentage of the population led to extravagant lifestyles, but it also established many of the cultural institutions we value today, such as museums, opera houses, and charities. High society's voracious appetites for fashion sped up the timeline so that fashion changed faster than it ever had before. Just look at the difference in 5 short years from the late crinoline era to the early bustle era. We looked at the transition away from the crinoline era in a past presentation. The round crinoline developed a sloped cone shape and long extensions on the back of the bodice. By 1870, the bodice had grown much longer extensions so that it draped over the top of the skirt, almost like another short skirt layer. The fullness of the hoop skirt pushes backwards, and the excess skirt fabric was pulled up in draped effects. During the 2 decades of the bustle era, there will be 3 separate phases of this fashion, one about every 5 years, forcing fashionable women and those who wish to keep up with them to remake their clothing or buy new outfits every 5 years, a laborious and expensive effort indeed. And just what is a bustle anyway? It can be hard to tell exactly what we're looking at in fashion plates. It appears complex on purpose. The more complex yet effortless a dress looks, the wealthier the wearer must be. There are 4 components to a bustle style. The first is the bodice, which will have long extensions past the waist. This extension hides the closures from the skirt below it, where a woman unhooks the skirt to put it on. The second piece is the base skirt underneath everything. This fits at the waist with a waistband. The base skirt usually has decorations or flounces at the hem. The third element is the apron that hangs down the front and swags up toward the back. It is attached to the skirt, not to the bodice. The fourth element is the back puffing or drapery that forms the bulk of the volume. It is also attached to the skirt. This is what some of the skirts look like without the bodice. There's a band that anchors everything around the woman's waist. Long vertical pleats of extra fabric add length and create an effect we call a train, the fabric that drags behind. Some styles feature horizontal pleats that draw the excess fabric up to create puffs that will stay in place. This adds fullness and the appearance of drapery. The skirt on the farthest right does both, adds horizontal drapery in front and vertical pleats in back. This skirt consists of two layers, an underskirt that features pleating at the hem and the draped apron. As you can see, these styles require an astonishing amount of fabric to wear, and this too is a factor of conspicuous consumption. Let's look at some of the hallmarks of the first bustle style. This style lasted about 5 to 8 years, and this one has the largest skirt shape. The waistline is in a high natural position. Here we can see the long bodice extensions in the back, and even some lappets or ribbon-like shapes. These attach to the bodice. The bodice looks like a jacket with looser sleeves that are fuller at the bottom. This is a remnant from the pagoda sleeve of the crinoline era. And notice the sleeve seam no longer sits very low on the shoulder or droops down the arm as it did in the Romantic and crinoline eras. The sleeve sits more on top of the shoulder. We no longer call the hoop skirt worn under these dresses a crinoline. It is now called a bustle cage or just a cage. At first, the crinoline is adapted by flattening the front and pushing the fullness to the back. This would be very hard to do on your own, so in most cases, women had to buy a new cage when the styles changed. There were many manufacturers that made different styles of bustle cages, so we see a great variety. It can be a real challenge when we look at photographs from this era to tell which bustle style we are looking at. Unless you had a great deal of money to spend, most women did not buy completely new cages or new dresses every time the fashion changed. They made do by draping their dresses differently or by adding a new skirt to an old bodice and redraping the fabric. Fabric was much more durable than it is today because it was a better quality. It was possible to make and remake dresses several times. This ensemble looks very much to me like this woman remade a light color crinoline dress, pushing all the extra fabric back into a bustle, and then she added a new dark skirt underneath that. I'm sure she'd be horrified that I think this. We see some of the important hallmarks of the first bustle shape here. The waist looks high, as if just coming from the crinoline era. Another hallmark is the looser, jacket-like sleeve ending in a bell shape with visual emphasis at the bottom. Evening wear and formal attire for women stipulated that it must be sleeveless and show the décolletage, or some of the area beneath the collarbones. Whenever you see a gown with small sleeves from this period, it is an evening dress. These first bustle dresses retain the horizontal neckline from the crinoline era, so they are very early styles, perhaps from 1868 to 1870. The long bodice extensions tell us they are in the early bustle era. The corset shape for this era is a bit straighter than the crinoline era. It will grow longer past the waist and over the hip as these decades move forward, and we will see why when we get to the second bustle shape. Beginning with the crinoline era and well into the bustle era, we will see some women practicing tight lacing to make their waist smaller. It was not necessarily a common habit, but a few women were famous for it, just as some women are now famous for their plastic surgery. This is a typical set of underpinnings a woman could wear under her dress. The chemise is now short and not visible below the corset. We can see her drawers, and she's wearing yellow stockings and dark shoes. This bustle cage is not a full petticoat style, but is a separate rounded cage added just to the back. This style of bustle cage is now called a lobster tail because of its resemblance. Because of the quick fluctuations in style and the differences in each woman's figure, some bustle cages were made to be adjustable. They could be made flatter or rounder. Sitting in a bustle cage was not difficult. The wires and coils fold up. This is one reason why you see so many chairs from this period that did not have arms. The fabric in bustle did take up extra room. Women could not sit all the way back into a chair, however, and you can see they are perching on the edge. Women wore an additional petticoat over the bustle cage with ruffles to soften and boost the shape of the skirt. During the 5 years, 6, 7, 8 years of the first bustle shape, the skirt shrinks in circumference. The drapery will make up more of the volume instead. This is a remarkable example of the scale of decoration used, such as wide stripes and large tassels. These are all trims and patterns we now associate with sofas and curtains. We can also see the 4 components. Each has gotten more elaborate. The front apron is much longer, almost to the floor. The back drapery is now a horizontal puff and a longer drape combined, and the underskirt features a train with rows of elaborate ruffles at the hem. Let's compare that to middle-class women. It was very important to avoid any appearance of poverty, so middle-class women made and remade their clothing to reflect the correct silhouette and shapes, but they could not afford quite as much fabric or trim, and their fabric was not as expensive. The second bustle shape was in style from about 1878 to 1883. It features a slender skirt that hugged the legs in front. The bodice now fits well past the waist and onto the hips. This style of bodice is called a Basque or Cuirass. We learned the term Basque in the crinoline era for bodices that fit tightly past the waist to hug the skirt. The term cuirass comes to us from ancient Greek and Roman armor. You will also hear this term applied to the long fitted style of bodice in some resources. One important feature is the point in the front of the bodice. The bodice is now longer than the waist, and it points. The sleeve now fits smoothly to the arm all the way down instead of fitting looser like a jacket sleeve, and there is often some kind of detail at the bottom. We will see great discrepancies between the fashion plate ideal and reality during this era. There were indeed very fashionable women who wore this slender silhouette, but it was considered daring to hug the legs so closely, so many women used a wider skirt. The biggest hallmark of second bustle gowns is the large volume at the top of the skirt will vanish, and the visual emphasis will drop down the back of the skirt, often as low as the knee or just above it. Many dresses featured this fishtail train that swayed behind a woman when she walked. It was considered extremely alluring. We will also see the tight-fitting sleeve with some decoration or a cuff at the wrist. In the photo on the right, you can see the slender effect over the hips and the back of the legs with a bow and decoration behind the knee. There were dress activists and reformers who publicly objected in the press to both the tight corsetry and these trains. They dragged in city streets and were considered unhygienic. Women who walked extensively could not afford such trains, or they had to wrap them up around their legs to carry them in the street. Evening wear of this time features the smooth, snug-fitting Basque bodice. We can see a long point down the front and the smooth fit in the back. The other 3 elements of a bustle dress have shifted slightly. The front apron is now long, covering much of the underskirt. The back draped section sits low on the body, and the underskirt with decorative ruffles is barely seen and forms part of the train. We have an important new garment that is particularly popular during this second bustle period. It is called the princess dress. It is made with no seam or break at the waistline. The dress falls from shoulder to hem in one piece. The couturier Worth created it for royalty, and it quickly grew in popularity. These princess gowns feature a contrast front panel in a different color, so it is easier to see the construction seams that run all the way down the dress. This line elongates the figure, which is part of the ideal shape for the second bustle. The princess gown tends to feature simplified bustle shaping in the back, although we can still see the low volume with detail at or below the knee and a train. For the middle and working classes, the princess gown was much easier to make a simplified version with a home sewing pattern. We have many examples of extant dresses made in more affordable fabrics. Evening wear in the second bustle shape bared a bit more of the arm. Notice the horizontal neckline of the first bustle shape evening gown is now a V shape, showing more skin in the front. In fashion plates, these gowns do not have sleeves, although we may see them on actual dresses remaining from the period. These may have been made for older or modest women who preferred to cover the upper part of their arm. The corset's shape changes for the second bustle era with a very long section over the hips. This shape strives for the hourglass ideal with bust and hips roughly the same circumference and a small waist. Dress reformers, including some from the medical profession, objected to the increasingly restricted corsets, advertising the damage that could be done to women's internal organs by years of lacing a corset too tightly. One serious side effect could be to compress the rib cage, as seen on this drawing of a skeleton. It's important to note that not every woman indulged in this practice, just like not every woman today has plastic surgery. A corset did not have to be worn this tightly as a matter of course. Second bustle cages ran the gamut of small ruffle pads to cages with graded sizes of wires that could be laced in or out for adjustability. There were so many styles available because of the number of different manufacturers. When we recreate this era in costume, one of the first decisions we need to make as designers is what kind of bustle to use to create the desired shape. The third bustle style combines the longer bodice line of the second bustle with a return of the large back skirt. Bodices will show a long point in the front of the skirt will remain slender, and all the fullness will spring abruptly from the waist at the back. The sleeve remains tighter fitting, but it sprouts a tiny standing puff or a slight widening at the top of the shoulder. This side view shows the abrupt angle of the high bustle placement in the back. The size of the train shortens so that it just lays on the ground or is eliminated for walking outdoors. You can see a deep curve at the back waistline. The sleeve will often be 3/4 to full length. We can still see all four components of the bustle at work here. The back of the bodice fits over the top of the bustle shape. The front apron provides volume. The back drapery is particularly extreme in this third style. And there is a base skirt with optional trim treatments. One important feature to notice here is the asymmetrical front drapery on the violet dress at the far right. This is a significant feature of the third bustle era and a landmark moment. It is not often that asymmetry is embraced in fashion design. Here we can see several variations on the asymmetrical front drapery and the front points on the bodice. The details of bodice styles in both the second and third bustle styles borrow heavily from men's shirts, suits, and waistcoats. Many bodice styles imitate the look of a waistcoat under a jacket front, like this one. Some will use pleats like those used on the front of men's shirts. Another common style will be the jabot front that imitates the man's wrapped cravat and lace front shirt from the 18th century or neoclassical era. Evening dress from the third bustle style repeats the same plunging neckline and sleeveless bodice of the second bustle period. The size of the train is longer for evening, and long gloves were worn up to the top of the arm. Once again, the style of bustle cage can vary widely by manufacturer to appeal to each woman's taste and need. Lighter versions were made and advertised for their comfort and ability to collapse with sitting. Working women could not negotiate these large bustles and settled for a more modest version made of padding or coils of wire. Let's compare some versions of the third bustle styles in photographs. The woman at far right is Princess Alexandria, wearing a full, fashionable bustle haute couture with a longer, formal train. She wears a skirt fronted with expensive lace ruffles. In the center, we see a well-to-do woman who can afford beautiful fabric and quite a bit of tasteful trim. Her bustle is the correct shape, but a bit more practical than a princess. And the woman at left wears a modified version of the bustle. She posed with books, so we can assume she is a serious and educated woman. The bustle is the correct shape, but smaller with less volume in the back drapery. Fashion was so elaborate now that even society women rebelled against the difficulty of dressing and wearing these garments all day. The tea gown is another new style that was worn at first by very adventurous women. This could be worn at home with or without corsetry or petticoats. During this era, public tea rooms are established, the first public places that respectable and or wealthy women could patronize without male escorts. At first, tea gowns were not permitted in tea rooms, as this was considered too casual, like wearing your pajamas in public. Eventually, the tea gown will become more accepted. The Victorians experienced an 18th century fashion revival called the Dolly Varden look, named after a character in a Dickens novel that lived in an idyllic village. This style will imitate a late 18th century polonaise, a gown that was worn open across the front and looped up to create a puff in the back. The 18th century version is pictured in the center. There were songs, dances, plays, and all manner of popular imagery celebrating this character. The fully shaped coat was an expensive garment that showed a woman could afford a new coat every time the bustle shape changed. There were shorter coats called the visite, seen here in the center. Short jackets were a common option that many women could afford and were marketed for middle-class or working women. The style on the right shows masculine details such as pocket flaps, and the time is soon coming when women will adapt tailoring to their own wardrobes. Hairstyles for the bustle period created volume on top and behind the head, like wearing a bustle on your head. False ringlets and braids are widely available to augment any style. Let's check on some real hairstyles for middle-class or working women who did not wear false braids or have help styling their hair every morning. One important feature was neatly dressed hair pulled tightly toward the back. Some women cut bangs across their forehead just to curl in a style they called fringe. Hat styles perch on top of hairstyles, adding more vertical volume. Small felt hats and soft fabric hats are decorated with lace and flowers and ribbons. The woman at the right wears a Dolly Varden hat inspired by the 18th century. We have evidence of drag ball culture beginning sometime during this era. These were secretive affairs. When dance halls were rented for these events, we know the windows were blacked out so no one could look inside. One ball even hired a blind musician so he could not identify any of the attendees. We know of a famous police raid that took place in 1880, but what we don't know is how long they might have been going on before attracting attention. It was illegal for men to wear women's clothing during this era. Women were given a bit more leeway, but they could certainly be socially ostracized for doing so. We have a very famous English couple, Frederick Park and Ernest Bolton, who were pioneers for cross-dressing. Dressed as Fanny and Stella, they made an elegant couple about town in London. The dress in the center is very much a Dolly Varden look, complete with her pastoral shepherd's crook. They were eventually arrested, but acquitted due to legal technicalities. One later toured as a female impersonator on the stage, and the other fled to America to live. Which brings us to yet another dichotomy in Victorian society. Men could not cross-dress in real life, but they could do so to appear on stage. The woman on the left is Madame Petrini, born Brigham Morris Young, a female impersonator that fooled audiences for years until his identity as a man was revealed. Female impersonators were becoming an accepted form of entertainment in dance halls and early vaudeville-style shows, as we can see in the photo at right of 3 Yale students in 1883.